Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show goes behind the scenes with the people who have been there, done that, and seen the results. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. Revenue Builders is brought to you by Force Management. We help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Find us at forcemanagement.com. Enjoy today's episode.
So, Tommy, you and I have known each other for a long time, and you've taught me so much about how to sell in government. What I want to do is try to kind of like break this thing down, and I think you've got a pretty good analogy to get us started here. But to break this thing down for the audience, there's so much difference between selling to the government and selling to the private sector. There's similarities and there's differences, but one thing that's the same is that you'll fail without proper discovery. So to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about here today, a lot of it is, as everything we talk about, Johnny Mac, is, discovery really is critical. And you're going to hear Tom talk about that when we just talk about kind of, getting information. So discovery in the government is a little bit more complicated than it is in the private sector because the concept of information needed is a little bit different. And there's so much information. The good news is there's so much information available. We need to talk a little bit about, that information. So Tom, what I like to do is start off with kind of like, what information do you need? We're going to talk about today. What information you need? How do you get access to it? What do you do with this information to successfully negotiate government contracts? And so to kind of get us started, why don't we start with that first question, which is, kind of what information do we need? And I think you got a cool little analogy to help us kind of get off to the right start here.
Yeah. So John, that's the most important thing is information. It's public and we want to sort through this. So the most important part is we want to learn about what's follow the money, and follow the money is nothing more than a concept that will identifying work that we do well and how and where the government's buying it. So the first thing is information. How do you get access to it? And we know that there's many sources, publications out there that have megabytes of information, but most of it's the rear view. It's news after the fact. We want to find out and get access to information ahead of time, and it's telling us what's coming. And there are tools that do that for us. They actually have lined up the procurement. The $700 billion that's outsourced each year by our government is actually lined up by, they call them NACS codes, and that's basically scopes of work. So if you're in the software industry, it'll say, hey, here's all the procurements the government's coming out with in the software world. Here's ones for just straight services. Here's ones for staffing. Here's one just for products. So the most important thing is when you're looking at this government world is, okay, do I do something well? And is the government buying it? So that's round one. So of course you read the news, you hear all that. Then it's like, well, that's a lot. How do I break it down? So one of the first parts we do in discovery is say, what do you do well? And say, what's the scopes of work? Okay. And what contract vehicles does the government use to procure my products and services? And so the first part of this is you do that alignment. And next thing you know, if you do it well, you're going to have a huge pipeline. But the next part is how do we qualify that? And the qualification starts, and you've heard us talk about follow the money and a compliance matrix. So we basically take an RFP and we look at the scope of work and we look at the instruction and the evaluation criteria and say, hey, what they're buying on those vehicles is where we feel we have the value. But in order to align and understand that, I like to use this analogy of a developer and a builder to connect the commercial terminology to the government. Because as we know, we got to be like, Bill Murray and Caddyshack here, don't we? We have to act, think, and speak like the gopher to catch the gopher. So we're trying to transition our business process, our language into that government acquisition and procurement world so that when we speak to people, we're able to connect the dots on the language and in the process, where we are in the process there. So at the end of the day here, contract vehicles are number one. The analogy of the developer and builder is that in the commercial world, let's say that you have $100 million, Kaplan Realty got this money and they say you got 100 acres I give you $100 million and you got 5 years to spend that, and you can build these 3 types of houses. So that is, okay, the starting point of what I call a contract vehicle. And in the government, the most common way they buy is through IDIQ contracts, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. As you can see, I have 5 years, I can build these types of houses, and I got so much money to spend. So that's part one. So now Kaplan Realty has to find somebody to build these houses. So what do? They put a procurement up. They write an RFP, a package, and they put it on their street. And what are they looking for? Who are the best builders? So you can imagine of a project that size, they're probably going to get, interest from 15 to 20 companies. So Kaplan Realty says, I'm going to narrow this down. So everybody goes, submits a bid, and they say, at the end of the day, you 3 or you 5, you want a seat at the table. You are the ones and the only ones that can now build those houses for me. That's the prime contractors in the government world. So we have IDIQ vehicle. Now we have these primes, and they're the players here. They're the people you want to focus on if you provide services that can support this initiative. Well, what's the next phase is Kaplan Realty says, I want to start with 3 ranch houses on my lot. So you bidders, you primes, send me a bid for that. Long story short is they pick one, and so builder 1 wins, and that's called a task order. Now the money hits the road here. So at this point, what we've done is to just try to connect some dots for you, is that's very common in the government. So if you're able to help with services, electrical, plumbing, or software to help control project, being on budget, anything that falls into that support of the building of the houses, and you play there, you want to pay attention to that. So round 1, we just sort of connected some dots here. So now the question comes back, John, you said, well, information, and where is it? How do I get it? I'm going to use my little DraftKings analogy, John, because I know you and I might want to do a little wager here. The Patriots dominate, and so you got Carolina Patriots in the Super Bowl, and I'm sitting there saying, John, I'm gonna bet my house on this one. Even though it's 6 points, I'm going to take, the Patriots. And John says to me, Tommy, let's take a step back here, because I'm an honest church-going guy. I got to tell you something. You haven't been paying attention, because man, right? I just went through a little black book here, and I got some inside info. And GOAT number 1, if you didn't know, isn't playing. And GOAT number 2, Mr. Belichick, is benching, Malcolm Butler for that game. So I can't take your money, Tommy. What's my point? Information ahead of time. Even DraftKings, and that's the world. So what we want to do is, part 1 is sort out the fact that there's all this information out there. You get free publications, and you're going to be reading the news. You're going to be at the table where there's no food left. How do we get ahead of the game? So now let's talk about how you do that, because if you knew that development was going to be built ahead of time, and you felt as though you had a good offering, why don't you try to target them? Because in the government world, it's public, and they're going to announce who those builders are that are bidding on. So we got to figure out how to get to that table. Like I said, John, about Thanksgiving, right? We don't want to be sitting in the corner. We want to be carving the turkey here, right? So how do we get there is we go back to where we talked about the information and say, okay, what part of this? Where am I relevant? Where do I have value and can differentiate myself? And it may be just in the fact that I do the plumbing and electrical. So what I do is I get my sales folks together, and we put a compliance matrix together. That's that CLNM.
Right, before you go there, we just talked about a lot. I want to just quick summarize. The analogy I love that you talked about was, how does money actually hit the street? And Tom will refer to something called follow the money. And it's a concept that he taught me and that we worked on together back in the day at a services company when we had to figure out if we don't know where the money comes from, we'll never be able to get it. And we'll always be following the money, or we'll always be following decisions. And you kind of brightened my horizon a little bit and said, let's follow the money. And we got to understand how the money flows. So Johnny McMahon, I know that we've got a lot of context there. A lot of, we talked about information, and we talked about kind of how information flows a little bit. Give us some insight or some questions as it relates to, like, from an audience perspective.
I want to kind of ground this. So, Tom, just to make sure, we're now talking about the U.S. government primarily, and we're talking about civilian, DOD, DOE, state and local, all the above? That's a question. Yes.
Yeah, correct. It's the federal civil, the Department of Defense, DoD, and it's the intel community.
Okay. And then, you talked about RFPs going to bid and then the prime contractors getting those primes. If we were in the DoD world, let's say, that could be companies like, just to ground the audience, that could be, let's say, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Honeywell, those types of companies, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
And then, you get a task order, which sounds like it's like a small build, almost like a prototype or a pilot project, or right before the final big contract gets awarded. Is that what happens with a task order?
No, the task order is actually where the money is actually transmitted from the government to that prime contractor. So in other words, if you have, let's say you were in a design build phase, you're going to build a defense system like Raytheon does, and they get pieces of it and they say, okay, Lockheed, Raytheon, who can do the design? So they have this $50 billion, but phase one is the design, and they bid off the design, and whoever wins gets a task order. So they may get $50 million for that task order to do the design. Then they could get into test. The next task order could be the test. Then it could be the prototype. So if you're building software in there, you might want to pay attention to the fact, okay, where are they in the phases where they need us to develop and do beta testing on software to show that it's integrated into my defense system here. But it'll be done in task orders.
The task order is not the entire contract for the entire, it's a part of it, maybe to prove out the design first before we go ahead and give Boeing or Raytheon or Northrop Grumman all the money to build the project.
Correct.
Okay. Now let's go back one step. You talked about all the information, but being a salesperson, when I'm hearing that an RFP has to go out, I'm thinking, how do I get in there earlier than that RFP goes out? Because I want to basically specify my product inside that RFP. So can you talk to us a little bit about how we get early access to the information so that we can be part of that RFP before it even comes out to the prime bidders?
Well, Mac, you're still on the show now, because that's the name of the game, right? So there are tools out there that actually have what they call they actually scrape the databases and consolidate in all the procurements. Every penny that the government spends has to be allotted and accounted for, and it has to be reported. It's public. So at the end of the day, there are special tools. So you get all these tools and publications, and usually giving you the rear view, like telling you after the fact that Raytheon is building the missile. But there is places where you can, and a lot of them are subscriptions you got to pay for, but they consolidate that for you. And basically they tell you these procurements are coming. So one of the misnomers is that everything takes so long in the government. Everybody ever heard that before? Well, Just think of it this way. Do you think those strategic builders and all them sending you information ahead of time, they're not going to give away a competitive advantage? But when the government's going to do a development, like our development example, or build something, they have to announce it. So it comes out so far in advance prior to the RFP, to your question, Matt. So what you're trying to say is, you know what? If my salespeople knew that was coming out before the RFP, and I could find out and maybe shape this thing, because a lot of companies, what they want to do is get in and say, well, if you're going to build fences, right? The picket fence is better than the chain link. And sure, if they do it right, it comes into the RFP. You try to shape the RFP. Also, you get an idea of the competitive landscape. So like, John, you had brought up something earlier too. It's like you got Northrop, you got Lockheed in that DoD world, right? Well, who really has the best chance of winning? So when you're getting information up front, and you start reading between the lines here, and you do that by our CLNM, what's the scope? What are they buying, and how can we shape it? That's the part that these systems can provide you. So the thing is, what system do you get that's aligned to your industry, that can help you align to scope of work, to the vehicles you want to pursue?
Okay, so let's back up a little bit. I'm running a sales force, and some of the reps are calling on, let's say, Lawrence Livermore Labs or Sandia National Labs, and they understand that there's some sort of project that's going to be built, and they hear that there's basically three primes that would bid on something like this. Let's just call it Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. Mm-hmm. Then what I would do is you take the information from my reps at Lawrence Livermore, and translate that information and tell my reps over at Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing, hey, you got to get in on this project now because these companies are going to bid on this, and we got to make sure that we're spec'd inside their bid for the task order. Is that correct?
Yeah, it gets a little more deeper, but you're on the right track of the fact that if you know those are going to be the primary players and getting a seat at the table, there's many things. You could go after all three of them and try to make sure all three of them know who you are so that no matter who wins, they're bringing your product in there. Or there may be a key one or one that you think is ahead of the game.
Yeah. So, Tom, what that also means is if I'm setting up a sales force from scratch to go call on the government, but I don't, let's say just DOD again, let's keep it simple. But I don't have people that are calling on, they think they're going to go to Washington and start calling on, the government, but they don't have sales reps in Lawrence Livermore Labs. They don't have them in Sandia. They don't have them in the primes. Like they don't have reps on Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. Their chances of winning some of these deals are between slim and none.
Yeah. So there's two parts. You can go talk to the government, and the government will talk to you if you have something. Now, this is, John, we go back to who do you call, when, and why. So now we're talking about speaking to the government. You want to go before the RFP's out, you can speak to the government. So you can speak to the contracting officer. Correct. Why? Because the contracting officer's job is to make sure the competition's out there and it's a fair procurement. So if you feel as though you have an offering or a solution that they have a procurement for, they will speak to you. And your goal there is to try to get as much much information out of them that says, hey, are we actually a player here, or do we need to shape things?
So this is Johnny Mac's question about how to potentially influence an RFP. And you said there's a contracting officer at the government. In every scenario, there's a contracting officer at the government who is responsible for making sure there's fair play, there's competition. So you have to, it's not should you, I mean, you have to have somebody in that stage at that time with that person, with that department or what have you, actually influencing and trying to influence and setting criteria. You also brought up the fact that you have reps that are in other, let's say, prime contractor companies that are calling on the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings and the, not only there's so much to break down here. There's like, these people have to bring value that says, we know what's going on because we're calling on the contract office. We're calling on the contract officer. We know what they're thinking about. We know what your capabilities are. We know what our capabilities are. And there's this whole dynamic of influencing it, not just at, I think this is the theme. You're not just influencing these things at one level or with one group. When you're thinking about a go-to-market strategy, you have to think about all the areas of influence in your analogy, Tommy, where it goes down to a task order where they say, in this huge $100 million development, I just want to build 3 homes. That's all we're talking about right now is 3 homes. And if I just go in and say, hey, I can build 3 homes, if I wasn't involved at the scope at the beginning when they talked about the $100 million development, I have no chance of participating in building those 3 ranch homes on the corner of that $100 million lot. Correct?
Yeah. And how I interpret Mac's question is, are you as a company going in, do you want to be a prime or do you want to be a sub? In other words, you want to take on the whole job of the whole house, or no, I just want to make sure I get the electricals, the plumbing. That's the starting point. And then it matters how you speak to the government and what value you bring, right? Because you may just want to influence the windows and make sure they put tile in. And the government says, I heard that. And next to the RFP has tiles. So it depends on where you want to play, prime or a subcontractor. That's the key to this. So once you understand that, then you break it down and say, okay, now what contracting officer, or now maybe it's more, I want to influence the prime. Maybe in that case, I'm going to Raytheon and say, Raytheon, you got the connections here. They need tiles, not, wooden floor, whatever it is. You're trying to get whoever it is that's going to bring you along for the ride for your revenue stream. It's all about getting a revenue stream with your core capabilities and competencies. and where the government's buying. So if you're a prime, you try to influence it all. If you're a sub, you get to those primes and say, we're the best one for you. You hire us or you bring us on your team, you're going to win because we're the best at this piece. And so the key word is team composition here too, John. When we did that developer situation, like a general contractor, all those builders, they call it a team composition of all the pieces that are needed to get the seat at the table and say, I'm the best builder for this. And of course, there were 3 of them. So they have a team composition that has all the components, pouring concrete, fencing, blah, blah. So if you're a player there, you want to target all the primes. So maybe you can be on all teams so that no matter what house they're building, I can build the fences for them. Or you may have to select your road because you may have a unique offer. You know, when you have a product like a security system or software, is it adaptable or is it just for a specific type of application?
So let's talk about that for a second, because my experience with you over a 10-year period of, you know, at Allegis and Tech Systems, that was a very complicated process. We had people calling on every department of the government. We had people calling on every prime contractor. We had people calling on subs. We had people going direct to, and this whole organization of it. And by the way, all the teams internally, they had quota. They said, I have to go get this business. They're trying to convince, you know, the company. And in many cases, it's an exclusive. So the prime is coming back and saying, okay, we're going to let you be our partner for this software, what have you. But if you want to do that, you only partner with us on this bid. And so I just want you to talk about that a little bit, Tommy. Like, that's complex. Somebody tells you, you want to play with us? You think we're going to make it at Northrop Grumman? You think we're going to be the one? Well, if you're going to go with us, you can't go with any of the other 3. Can you kind of talk about the dynamics of that and how you manage that as like a sales leader?
Okay, so the first thing, if you remember when I came in, we built what's called the playbook. That's the higher level of, okay, what are we going after? We had healthcare for agency. So you got an agency and contract vehicles and you have all those primes. So now I know the competitive landscape. And then we figured out where the spread was, if you remember. And at the end of the day, what we were trying to figure out is where did we have value and on a contract vehicle? So there's a couple scenarios that arise. Hey, we already have people working on this contract. Where is it at? It's up for recompete. So now I have leverage if I know, okay, and what we normally do in the staffing company, what happened is they go to Northrop Grumman. This is a true story, and I can tell you many of those. And they're saying, okay, listen, you're a staffing company. Yeah, just sign this teaming agreement, and we'll call you if we win. And in the agreement, it was exclusive. Remember this? So now we started flipping the tables here, like, well, wait a minute. Like, well, I'm going to go call Lockheed tomorrow then because they're willing to, I got all these people. Now I have referenceable past performance. Why wouldn't I go over here? So this is back to the kids table, the adults table now. We went off the kids table. We're now at the decision-making table because we connected our value ahead of time. And we said no. And how many times they signed these agreements and go sat in the corner until something, they got jump balls for X maybe. We flipped it on, we not only have 20 or 30 people here, the agreement and the team, we're going to keep those plus 20% on the next one.
So Johnny McMahon, just to give you a flavor, when I showed up at this company that Tommy and I were at, and thank God we found Tommy to come in and do this, I'm trying to get a flavor for, you know, what are we measuring success? And all these people were telling me, we've got teaming agreements in place here, teaming agreements. And I'm thinking, wow, we got great coverage with all these primes or what have you. And we weren't getting squat.
We had no committed work share. There were blanket agreements. We were signing exclusive agreements with no quid pro quo. There was no commitment back. So when you hear committed work share, that's your goal. Yeah. And if you remember, John, when I came in, what the problem, you know, you saw one part of the problem. You know what the other people thought the problem was? They was like, hey, I had 40 grand in spread and it disappeared. And it's like, yeah, because it went from Booz Allen to Lockheed, so follow the money. They didn't have that. So part of what you were talking about is, okay, I own Northrop and I own Lockheed. I got 2 different people in the organization. So what we did was we started organizing by agency and contract vehicle. We changed it up. So yes, you were responsible for the account, but the end game was the contract vehicle. So go back to how do you maximize sales? Now you're this company that does tiles. What if you're on every team, every prime? So no matter what prime one, they're putting your tiles in. That's the goal. So if it's your software or your products or whatever you have, your ultimate goal is to get a revenue stream, and you don't have to compete, and you get it at your rates. So you get to the table there, and that's where you can leverage. And staffing companies wouldn't do this. Well, no, I'm not going to go call the competitor, right, of that company because I'm scared, right? As opposed to, no, hey, you know what? If that's the agreement, I'm going to call them. Well, you're going to go call them? Well, why wouldn't I? It's business. So quid pro quo here. I came to you first. And that's the mantra we started. But to get back to your original question, it was the playbook level. Agency and contract vehicles ruled, right? And then you said, now when you do, you'd call maybe a territory plan, or our account and territory plans were contract vehicle plans. We knew all the primes out there and all the vehicles. And then we knew the where we fit in. So now the conversations were more relevant, and we could differentiate ourselves from both our capabilities as well as our past performance. Now we could leverage that. And we're saying, well, if we're on this contract now at X and you want us to stay on the team, we're getting at least 20% X on if you win. And you're only going to us for these areas.
And you keep talking about past performance. I just want to throw this in there for our audience. Proof points, case studies, testimonials in the public sector, if you will, or the commercial sector, those are gold. And we say, if we got a proof point, we got a case study, we got a testimonial, that's how you create value off of those proof points. In the government, Tommy, it's the exact same thing. And it's even weighted higher, because if you don't have past performance, let's say you have a new software, but you don't have any experience in the government, they are going to, I'm not saying they're not going to use you, but you are going to have a very difficult time if you can't translate whatever you've done into what the government calls past performance.
John, there's actually a legal definition term in the government. There's a difference between past performance and past experience. So everything you're talking about is my experience in the private sector or whatever. It's good, but to get you zero on the evaluation criteria, CLM. Past performance really means that you have a referenceable government contract. So back to Mac's question in the beginning is, I'm going to go from this commercial world industry into government, and you just want to go bid, on a major contract. The first thing they're going to say is, do you have any referenceable government contracts, especially with that agency and a relevant scope of work, same size, same shape for that agency. So if you don't have that, you're starting from ground zero. So what we have to figure out, and this, John, we went through this in our exercises back at the old company there, is that, okay, we do have experience and we have leverage. So the best thing is to know in the cycle, where is the government in the cycle for these procurements? So we can at least use that leverage and get those agreements, based on our experience. Then when we got on subcontracts, they became referenceable subcontracts. So those subcontracts versus a staffing agreement, that doesn't mean nothing. Next round, it's still nothing. But you turn it into a subcontract, move up that food chain like we talked about, and you sit at tables like, that's my agreement. Now I'm referenceable and I can take it anywhere I want. And that's important. So that's the other key element. How do you, information, getting it ahead of time to position yourself. And sometimes your value is just your past performance. Sometimes it's your experience with what your capabilities are. But when you have a combination of that, back to Mac's point, and if I say I went to speak to the government, even if you're going to be a sub, and that government says, I think we need tile floor instead of this, and that brings value of knowledge ahead of time. Like, hey, maybe Brady ain't playing this week, will change your decision making here. It's the same thing. What is the government thinking? Who's on that source selection? Whether you're a prime or and you're a sub, helping the team composition know that information is value. So
and that's the value you bring as a supplier, as a potential sub, as a partner. That's the value you bring with all of that knowledge, which goes back to John's question or comment about having people at Northrop, having people at the agency level, having people it's all got to come together in like a symphony. That's why I wanted to do this podcast, because this is freaking hard. People are like, oh, government, there's money there. And then they go after and like, oh, it just takes too long to get government money. And it was an interesting ride.
Well, it's a startup, and then they think you're gonna effectively call on the government and all the prime contractors, and you put two reps on it.
Well, it's not going to work. Mac, now you're going to now the mistakes made. See, so John, at the end of the day, I came from Northrop Grumman Taft. We're security intel, right? So we had a lot of competition, and there's a lot of incest in the government when it comes to you prime with them, you sub, you compete, right? But you had barriers there, right? Here I come into a staffing company, and you're saying you got all these people out there. It's like this is heaven, because then you take all the knowledge about across those companies, keep it in context. Now I know the competitive landscape and what the real value or gaps they have. And you know how it is, John. It's always find those gaps too. How do we fill those gaps for them?
Now, Tom, let's talk about going back to the RFP or before the RFP. Let's say I have all this information you talked about and I can get in early, really early. And I want to position myself as someone that has if we're talking about the houses again and tiles, I have a unique tile that and some capabilities about that tile that none of my competitors have. And I want to try to spec in my tile into these programs or the contract vehicle so that when it does come out to bid, everyone has to use my tile when they bid. Can you talk about whether or not how that can happen and what some of the mechanisms are?
Yeah, that is really hard actually to get it. There's a difference between a capability being spec'd in an actual product. The government is not going to, very seldom, point to a product or a manufacturer straight out. The government won't. Okay. So if you're in that world, so there's all extremes of this conversation. So that extreme you're talking about is more when you get to the integrators and say, listen, if you're bidding this, there is no question that we're the best, and the government knows it, but they can't direct you to an Oracle or an IBM or whatever it is. They can't do that. They can't specify unless there's nobody else out there that can do it. And that's where you see RFIs come out. So Mac, you go ahead, so get an RFI. The government's saying, is there anybody out there that can do it better than others? Blah, blah, blah. So when you see RFIs in your area, that's where you pay attention, because you can respond to the government and say, you know what? We're probably the only software product out there that can do it. And if they hear that and nobody else disputes it, that's one way your product can be written into a spec. But it's a very hard thing to do. Be bet usually is when you do this.
Go to the primes.
Yeah, go through the primes.
Going to the primes, if it's going to be three of them, let's say Honeywell, Lockheed and Northrop Grumman, then I'm going to go to those three, and I'm going to try to do the same thing that we just talked about, try to spec my unique capabilities into their program.
But Tommy, absolutely. I saw with my own eyes some, like Department of Defense, I saw influences from military personnel in software that actually directed contract officers. You said they can't specify, but can you talk a little bit about the influence? Because I also saw influence at like generals in the military.
It's very hard to do unless you are, number one is very people can't dispute its capability and what it does. And so the best way of doing it is, product's so good, but see this system you're building? For that system, it's the only product. It's hard. And yes, you're going to have, just like government's like business too, where you got a general, it's like, I'm going to figure out a way here. And sometimes you even see executive orders come out and say, we're going to give that money to them for building wind machines and all kinds of it happens, right? But for the people that are listening here, I'd really like them to focus on the fact that, number one, I need to know if I'm getting the information I need for my company and my pursuits, that I can align and get ahead of the government, because they have to make it public. So what am I doing the right things out there? And then to your other point, I was going to come back to about hiring. Who do you hire? And the common thing is, Sally Sales sold to Northrop, pencils. So she must be very good at selling to the government, because it was a government client. Well, no. And if you heard anything today on this podcast, say you're an executive, it's like, okay, if I'm going to go after this industry, let me figure out who actually understands, first of all, what a contract vehicle and the procurement process, what do they go through, who the players are, what is a contracting officer, it's a program manager, where in this whole scheme of things do I get the data I need? Because it's mega and terabytes out there. So I want a person that first knows that what information, how to get it, what tools I use, and how to filter it, apply it to my offerings, and align it to the vehicles. That's the number one thing. Then you get into now how you go, what I call customer engagement. Now, how do I build a pursuit plan with relevance and value to get to the adults table and be a decision maker to carve the pieces of turkey I want at Thanksgiving? So there is a process there. So, and it's a little different, John, than commercial tactical sales, where, you're not going into this like, I'm just selling this product. I don't care if you need it or want it, just buy it. That's GSA schedules. Let's put it that way. So if you're into the just tactical sales, that's why they put out GSA schedules for the people that have commercial products. For example,
I need a pencil, I buy a pencil.
There you go. Or a desk. The government has to buy them, but you're not a government. So they put out GSA schedules for things like that. For products and services and software, you can actually apply for a GSA schedule. Now you have a contract vehicle, a mechanism for the government to buy. So if you really have those, and that's what a lot of software companies do, or should do.
I was just going to say, that's what a lot of software companies are doing, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. That's if nothing else, the first thing I ask companies in discovery is, what do you do? What do you do well? And what have you done for the government? Okay, how you want to get there? What are your desired business results from what you do? And do you have any idea of the opportunity? And then how do you focus? And at the end of the day, you got to be willing to get on contract vehicles, access to information, access to contract vehicles. So once you get the information, it's like, if now, John, you're the big sales guy running the place, the first thing I'm asking these government BD salespeople is, how are you going to create access to vehicles and get me new revenue streams? And the first thing I better hear is contract vehicle, and then here's when the task orders come.
So this
and
is
by
an
the way,
important point. This is an important point. Let's highlight that, because I get a lot of questions. And Tommy, I'm always saying, go call Tommy at the Talisman Group now. But when they say, hey, what's your experience with the government? How do we go get government business? Blah, blah, blah. I think that's really, really important. It's not having experience at a prime or experience at a department. It's experience with knowledge of understanding how to get on contract vehicles. Mm-hmm. And I just want to make that very, very clear, because there's a lot of people that ask me, and I'm sure you too, John McMahon, how do we take this to the government? It's, you get a lot of people that say they've called on the government, and then a year later, you're burning cash on a couple of people in the government, and they're not doing anything.
That's the majority. It's the majority. John, there is that difference there between, okay, looking at the sales territory plan, and then you know how it is now. You do your AOPs, your annual operating plan, and how you progressing. And the way to progress through this is to actually go through and see what's the timing of the line. By the way, once you're in this cycle, this long cycle, once you start hitting, remember, these things are voluminous. So you hit one of these. And if you remember those days where
past performance.
Yeah. And then it's like, so when the government buys, like, especially just talk about labor, right? The numbers, it's the largest procurer of human capital in the world is our government. Okay. Yeah. So if you're in any type of services or staffing, whatever the hell you do and you provide people, that's the name of the game. So if you do that, you definitely want to take a look at that process and getting in that business, right? But the cycle, once you're in, like, I can tell you stories, and the person, and Reston, right, go in there, and the lady walks out the door, she's going to SIC for the meeting, and it's like, well, this is how Follow Money started, John. If you remember, there were two reasons. This was the second one. Well, I'm going to the meeting. And I said, well, what's the meeting? Did you go and look at the stuff? Oh, yeah, I did. And she went to SIC, came back, they gave her 10 recs for IT people. And I'm saying, well, what's the program? And she hadn't looked it up. So we went in, looked it up. Bottom line is they need 200 IT professionals. I said, you're turning around, you're going back. And that's when she went to big kids table and say, listen, this is the program you're on. You need 200 people. I could shut down my office and they'll all do this job for you. And I said, if you can do 200, I'll give you 200. She went to 45 grand overnight.
I remember.
A week. Okay. What's the point? The point is, again, people even have these tools and don't know how to use them. So one of the other parts is, first, what tool best aligns to my business? And two, how do I correlate the necessary information? So I'm building pipelines of qualified opportunities.
And we didn't really talk about those tools, though, Tommy. So let's do that, like the information tools. Would you mind just kind of running through some of the top ones so we to make sure we've got them.
Yeah, and I don't want to taint anybody, but there's a bunch of them. But the most common one is GovWinIQ from Delta, right? And so that's the Cadillac, and they do the best at. And you've all heard like govsam.com and stuff. So this procurement websites that are reporting as it's going. This company started in the accounting, and of course, counting money, that's how it aligns, and said, hey, what if I can get all this data and turn it into a procurement database? So this GovTribe, this GovWinIQ, right? And basically what they are is, and they're getting really good at it, is first, they're telling you about all the procurement. So you get all the history, what's coming, timing, RFPs, when they're coming out. So that's correct. Then it also has corporate profiles in there. So you can, John, you say the first thing is you get an account. Let's go look at who the leader is. You can go in there and get all their point of contacts, okay? For Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, okay? You can do it for the government. Who's making decisions for the government? You can actually get pricing data. You can get correlation. So at the end of the day, if nothing else for people listening, if anything I told you you don't have, you're a huge disadvantage. And that's the scare tactic. Like sometimes in religion, you want to scare people about going to church. Well, this is the scare tactic. This is our religion scare tactic. It's like, if you don't have this, go home. Or if the people you're hiring don't know that they should get it and what to do with it, that's how you try to look at who you're hiring. Because, the most important things are infrastructure, tools, technology, and people, right? Those are the people that's the whole thing is a system. And that system is going to have that tool technology use correlation of data quickly for you so that you can arm your people so that they can get at the big kids table. And at the decision-making time, they know how to negotiate a teaming agreement with committed work share, right? That's the simplicity of all this. I just walked you through. Get that, align it, contract vehicle, task order, get to the primes. Ideally, you're on all primes, or whatever prime you're on, you got total committed work share. So when that business comes through, it's sent to you and the volume is high, and it's at your negotiated rate too, John. Even for staffing companies, like none of this right to hire stuff. I get life of contract. So if I'm building houses for 5 years, you're paying me for 5 years.
I want to talk a little bit about that. We've been talking about the RFP a little bit. You've said CL&M a few times. This was revolutionary to me because from my commercial background, this was the thing that made me breathe easier when I understood I get a 50-page RFP or 150-page RFP, and my teams are staring at it, and I'm like, oh my God. Like, until you kind of showed me what CL&M on every single government RFP, could you just walk through that? Like, you get 150 pages of an RFP. Can you kind of walk through? You taught me to go look at CL&M. Could you walk through what those are? Those are actual sections in an RFP.
Yeah, every federal procurement is pretty much consistent now. And Section C is the scope of work. That's what the government is buying. Section L is the instructions. Okay, if you're going to bid on this, what do you need to give me? Section M is the evaluation criteria. Once you give this information to me, now this is how you're going to be evaluated.
So this is gold right there. Like,
gold.
That's medic. There's medic in there. That's like gold. That was so clear for my thinking.
Yeah. So what we did was, if you remember, you helped me, and we put you put the construct together. It's like what we're trying to do is make the sales consumable. And we took if you heard of Shipley. Shipley is like the Library of Congress on all this stuff, right? And I said, well, we don't have time for that. So you help me. Remember, make it shorter, get to the point. I said, okay, at the end of the day, when you get that 2.5-inch RFP, go to Section C and read that scope. And if you remember, we walked through this, we drag them through the glass, and they say, oh, the scope, I'm going to bid this. And you say, well, what if you had Section L? And then we get to Section M. So the point is, those 3 sections, you start and you train your people to go read those. Could you just go over them again? Could you go over them again? Just high level. C is the scope of work.
Yep.
L is the instructions. What do I need?
And in the instructions, what is typically in there? Give an example of all the way through CL&M.
Yeah, very, very good. So now you got this job, and the instructions are, you're going to provide me, your technical approach, your management plan, your staffing plan. You're going to give me past performance. This is where they lay out what you have to give to the government for review. So if you remember, we did the igloos for Eskimos as our example. It's like we're doing the course and say, okay, you get all this. Oh, igloos, we build igloos. I'm bidding. It's like, wait a minute, right? Then it says, then you got to deliver all this past performance. And the past performance says, we only need igloos that are 10 feet tall that you built in Alaska. And it's like, well,
Bingo.
we don't have that. So
you can't just look at C. C is the scope. L is the instruction about the scope. What's M?
Evaluation criteria.
That's the decision criteria.
There you go. So when the other term, everybody on this phone, everybody on this call should hear is compliance matrix. So when you go and talk to that builder, that prime contractor about negotiating that teaming agreement, common thing is I'm going to walk you through my compliance matrix. You've just aligned the company you're representing and product and say, see that RFP? This is how we're relevant to what they're buying. This is what we're going to give to you. And this is how you're going to be evaluated if you use us, and it's going to be top notch because we have all the experience in doing this. Okay.
So compliance matrix, a compliance matrix is your company's beginning kind of value alignment with CL&M. You put together this compliance matrix, you go talk back to the people that are asking you to participate in this RFP and to the partners and to the primes, and you say, here's my value to this RFP or this bid, correct?
Relevance, value, differentiation.
Because it might not even be the RFP might not have come to you, but you know that RFP is going out to one of your primes. You still look at CL&M and you help them with their CL&M. That's how business gets done from a teaming perspective, correct?
Yeah. And so the difference between that and the normal commercial sales, what do the commercial salespeople go? They call up on the account and they just tell them they open the fire hose. This is what my company's all about. No idea of the relevance that this person you're talking to only cares about that one contract vehicle. So everything you said might have been great, doesn't care. And you're like, why didn't they care? And if you remember, we had a follow the money course. At the very end, a lady get up and said, Tom, I feel so stupid. I just spent the last 2 weeks trying to answer a question from the prime, but all the responses to the RFP, and they kept saying, but no, I need this and I need this. And now she said, ding dong, ding dong. They wanted me to take our capabilities and make it relevant to that contract. They don't care about the rest of the world. So that's where knowing who to talk to. If you're talking to a capture manager, what do you ask them? What contracts are you pursuing? Oh, you'll get fired if you don't win.
Okay, back up. Contract manager. What is that? Who is that?
No. We're backing up. So government will have a contracting officer.
Sorry, capture manager.
So now we're going to the primes. The three people okay, now that's where I say now the customer engagement. Now you get all this information. You know where you're supposed to go to Northrop or Lockheed. Who do you call? So if it's in a bid, you go to the capture manager. Capture manager is going to get fired if he doesn't win or he or she doesn't win. So you need to be prepared to talk to them. Well, let's say that this is an existing contract and it's got a future. And what happens if you meet the program manager? Well, what does a program manager get fired for? Delivery. So when you get to program managers, or let's say that this thing is going to come up for recompete and you know the program manager, you go and say, hey, if you have any gaps, anything that you need help in, what you could do better next time. So who you speak to is now the next phase of all this. So now we know all the information we gathered, but now we get it ahead of time. How do we use it and who do we talk to and when is also important. Because again, when you come to the commercial world, we transmit. Well, I'm the best tile company. Well, this contract doesn't need tiles. Program manager, where are you having troubles? Where's your gaps? Okay, where are you? But first, where are you in the cycle? It's like, hey, we're a great design engineer. It's like, hey, the design was over 6 months ago. You missed the boat here. You know, the old information. But if you know that these things are coming out and you know that your company can do pieces of it, like go back to the analogy of the houses. It's like, you know, what are they going to do first? Hey, they're going to pour concrete. You know, we got a concrete. We'll tell them, hey, good timing. I need somebody to help me on the concrete. Or we're in the phase of the tiles. If you know where they are in the cycle, that's the most important part.
Okay, so John McMahon, level set us a little bit. We've been information, how the information flows, how to go get the information. When we're asked to respond to something from an RFP perspective, now we've got a way to break down this 2.5-inch booklet with CL&M on scope, instructions, and past perform. What was M?
Evaluation
criteria.
Evaluation criteria. Okay, so Johnny, help us kind of settle the dust for us a little bit on from an audience perspective.
It's like most sales. You better get it in early, get the right information, and get to the right people. And what Tom's done is done a really good job of outlining, the scope of work and contract vehicles, how they change into task orders, and the RFP, and then how it goes out to the prime, and then they generate a task order. But being as early as you can with the government agencies, with the primes, so you can get your product spec'd in there if you can, or have influence over it, is what Tom's really talking about. It's like anything in sales. The earlier you're in the account, the better discovery you can do, the better access to information that you have, the better you're going to perform.
Yeah, and to go full circle, like let's have an you're an executive at a firm that's trying to get in the government flow, and you're responsible for this team out there. I think the bigger picture is there is a lot more money and vehicles out there. So it's very important that you have a plan of measuring the progress. And first, what is the attack here? What does that go to market? And that's what I say about arming the people. So if you don't understand, it's pretty hard to arm your people. So we talked about the general stuff about, getting ahead of the game and task order. And that's important. You got to know the terminology. That was the gopher, right? But at the end of the day now, we actually have to execute. So that's the part where we want to put these pieces together, and then you build I call it a playbook to start. And playbooks can be different variations here, but hey, what do we do well in this industry? So let's say it's healthcare, right? We provide nurses and stuff like that. So, okay, they're a contract vehicle. So you start narrowing it down. What agencies? DHA, the veteran VA. Okay, military health. Okay, that's what we're going to target. So you have to be able to take that, narrow it down so that you have an intelligent approach to the government industry. And it should come back to agency and contract vehicles. And then you talk about arming your people with the information from these tools like a GovWin or a GovTribe. Why? Because if they don't have it, they're late. Not just late to the game, they're not relevant. That's the starting point of relevance by CLNM, right, John? We got CLNM here. Now you're building your organization. Let's train the organization, because this stuff grows fast. You're going to need a lot of people out there, okay, hitting the streets here. But you want them in sync, and they also have to know the difference between if you're calling on Northrop and you're calling on Lockheed, they could be going after the same contract vehicle. Somebody in the organization has to put that together. So if you're building an organization and you want to make it big versus one-offs, you have to be thinking about how the vehicle's tied to the primes and what's your approach. If you have people focus on accounts, they have to be aware of if you focus what I call initiative-based, okay? So now if the leader keeps all that straight, you're all set. But you run into a lot of conflicts of interest internally, which we had, John, if you remember too. It's like, well, I get the 50 grand of spread with Northrop. This is a true story. And it's like, well, I'm not giving you any information because we're saying, but Lockheed could win this. You can create tension internally now because that's not my account. And that's how follow the money concepts started.
Yeah, let's just level set a little bit. Let's level set a little bit. When Tommy's referring to, we were actually working at a IT staffing company together. And when he talked about accounts versus the company was set up on an account basis, and I didn't get it until Tommy came along, and government was only part of my responsibility. But I didn't get it until I really understood that it was kind of that was not the conversation. It wasn't about an account conversation. It was about an agency conversation and a contract vehicle conversation, and then the following the money between those, which became so important. So, and also, if you're listening to this, Tom has mentioned spread a couple of times. What that is the profit margin between, and we were dealing in human capital, it's a profit margin between what it costs to have an employee there versus what you're charging to have an employee there. That difference that you get to keep in your profit margin in that industry is called spread. So if you've heard that a couple of times. John McMahon, before I go into, I really want to help people understand how to get a hold of this 100-pound brain, Tom Smerczynski. Any other questions that you had about anything?
Like Tom, to help the audience here, Tom. There's a lot of people that are listening to this that are in startup software companies, and they all think that eventually, once they get to a certain size, okay, I did 50 million this year, I did 100 million. It might be time for me to put some salespeople on the government, right? Can you talk just a little bit, if you were going to start from scratch, how many people and where you would place those people if you were a startup software company to at least effectively start to call on the government, whether it was DOD, DOE, civilian, state and local, whatever it might be? Which one, how would you structure it with how many people to do a minimum effective job?
It's a tough answer to quantify. The first thing I would say is you go through a discovery phase and figure out what that offering is and where the best chances of getting it onto government contract vehicles, right? So let's say you do artificial intelligence, and now it's becoming a big thing in the healthcare industry, right? So you want to use this stuff like this gearing ratios and metrics they use, okay? So it depends on what the software is intended to do. Is it just a standalone? Is it something that's integrated and modifiable? And what industry does it affect? Is it finance? Is it security? Is it healthcare, DOD? What? And so you first want to, I say, you do a discovery session to say, what's the opportunity? And that's where we use the tool, John. It's like, okay, so what's the first thing I should do is, okay, that's my offering. Let's run some scenarios in a search and say, okay, this is the size of the opportunity. And then it's like, that's the whole government. Then it's like, well, what parts of the government, right? And it could be the state part as well, state and local, federal, DOD. And then it's like, okay, let's say it's just Fed Civ, right? So it's the federal civil side of things. And what agencies you want to go after? So a lot of healthcare is VA and DHA and military. So, okay, so we're going to focus there. So I would start with a person that would first understand, okay, I have a person that understands what I just said, enough to build a plan and approach. And then it could snowball in a good way, or it could just, be stagnant, because now it's access to vehicles and timing. So if you don't have any contract vehicles, there could be a gap here, right? And so one of the approaches you use, especially let's say you have an offering that's, say, like the builder situation where no matter who's building it, they could use my tiles. If the software has sort of that flavor to it, and it can go across a lot of vehicles, different ballgame. If it's unique, so you got to do that discovery phase one to say, what's the opportunity and how quick can I get there? And that goes from information to access to vehicles. And do they have a GSA schedule too? Because a GSA schedule you can bring to the table to these agencies to say, well, you don't even have to go through that. You can just put it out on GSA and I can bid for it over there if you want. So I always say you build the roadmap. This is what I do all the time, John. This is what I'm being asked all the time. It's like, okay, so I say, wait a minute, before you go too far here and start hiring people, let's do the first phase of a roadmap. What are the required capabilities for you to be successful? And then talk about where the people come into play here. Maybe you already have some people. Maybe you have enough connections or something like that. But you've got to define what you do well and you believe you can transport into these agencies and have somebody that can do that for you. When you say, and I say build a pipeline of qualified opportunities. And the answer to the test is always, okay, well, how long is it going to take me to get money from the government now? And what happens if you find a vehicle, like you can get it tomorrow, if you find one of those primes that already has a contract, put you to work, right? And that's where, John, we started going down the path of that's where and Mac, you had asked earlier about the minority companies and the set-asides, they can get work like that if you set up your qualifications. Well, most companies that are just getting into it, they have to say, the most important thing is when we're all done is I'm going after that vehicle because it's going to only take 3 months. It's going to be awarded in 3 months, and now I'll have access and a revenue stream for you. So that's the long answer to the fact that I would want somebody to have a roadmap of what we need to do to be successful with those tools and what I'm going to do with it. And the other lining factors you're doing the roadmap timeline is, if I'm successful, which I can say right away, if the government's buying this, what vehicles and how long will it take me to get access to those? And then who do I need to go through? So if I'm going through the builder mentality, who's that lineup of accounts to target that have access to the vehicles that will probably answer my call? So, and You can't just hiring somebody and telling them to go sales that's what the majority of companies do that are very small. And I say, well,
Mac, we've seen that movie.
We've seen them all break their pick doing that type of stuff. I was just trying to see if get you to give the audience some advice, which is what you did. And typically, you have to do the same thing in the commercial accounts. You have to figure out who your ideal customer profile is and why you're unique, and who the persona is that you're going to call on and what your messaging would be. And you're saying the parallel is to do the same thing in the government before you just start hiring people.
And translating to government language, John.
Yeah,
translating it to government language.
Sure. Yeah, the one difference in the commercial world, you can get the deal on the golf course. In the government world, you can't. And what I mean by that is no matter what happens, whoever controls the purse strings, and we have a checks and balance for good reasons, it's still got to go through that mechanism. So yes, in the commercial world, you just happen to know the right person at a big corporation. Commercially, they can give you work. And so maybe that's why you hide the person, contacts. This one, the contacts are important, but you got to trust that the person understands the process to get from A to B, which is opportunity to revenue stream. I say, how could you get to that? What's the timing? And if they already have a vehicle in place, the people, I have a contact at Raytheon and they already have a contract vehicle, they give me work tomorrow. It could be tomorrow, but your litmus test with anybody you hire or you're putting in there is what's the status of the contract vehicle you're targeting, where are they on the cycle, and when do you expect the revenue to start, and so on and so forth, like we just talked about.
Hey, so Tommy, I'd be remiss. I want to make sure that in this episode, at least, I think we're probably going to come back and talk about like the who, how do you establish your value? Who do you talk to? What do you say? That would be I think you've given us a really good understanding of the structure. And then maybe we'll come back and talk about how do you execute through people, personas, and those types of things. I'd like to spend a little bit more time on that. But I also want to, you've developed a company with your massive expertise for the people out there. As you can well imagine, this is the gentleman that I tell everybody that he will forget more about government procurement and doing business in the government than most people ever learn. So will you tell us a little bit about what you do with the Talisman Group? A little bit about how do people engage with you, kind of some top level deliverables, and let's just make sure people can get to you after listening to this podcast.
Yeah. So, John, you have a website, and most of the way it works is the companies I'm helping, I'm basically helping them on the journey, like to Matt, to a lot of your questions. People that have companies and offerings that really, maybe I should get into the government. Of course, when things like a pandemic hits and stuff, everybody wants, right? So the basic thing is I have a network of people that can help in the key areas too. So they want to get into the government and they say, okay, and I usually recommend this discovery phase. John, you're very familiar with that. We go through and we just want to basically align their goals and what do they do? What do they want? Goals and objectives. What are they trying to accomplish here? And we may stop there and say, okay, it could be a long shot, right? And then the second part is get the stakeholders in the room, and do it. I call it tiger team. Okay, whoever's going to be a part of this gives their view on the world of government, how they think they can get there. And then at the end of the day, if they're in agreement, what do we need what do we need to do and build required capabilities? So if you can think of now accounting systems and contracts and security, part of my network is that if we get to those phases, okay, you need somebody and I know enough to be dangerous here, but I remember I ran an 8A company. We started and ran to it. So that's why I learned all the rules. They're all the FARs, Federal Acquisition Regulations, accounting, security. I was thrown into the fire, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, right? I was dragged through the glass, John, for a few years, but then I could wear all hats. Pricing, cost accounting systems, right? So when companies are going and transitioning, I think the best thing I add value to is let's look at the roadmap before you start investing too much money here. Look at the infrastructure, tools, technology that we talk about. Then if you want to go further, what do you need? Do you need to get a GSA schedule? What is your plan to target? And you're going to go prime, you're going to be a sub, right? So what is your goals there? Accounting-wise, do you have a cost accounting system? Do you want to go into DOD and Intel world where you need a security clearance? So you do a roadmap. Just like you, Mac, you asked about just that salesperson, how many you will hire. It's the same thing. That's part of this build out of your required capabilities, but it has to align to your business goals and objectives too. And so the language is always a challenge, and the how. So there's a little bit of learning and professional development always in here where, okay, and John, I talked about this, and we were preparing for our calls to say, hey, we need the audience. We want to help them on their journey here, but also open their eyes to the fact that there is definitely a language situation of terminology that's very important. The who, it's not just one person, and you do this anyway, John. You do it for a living, the sales. Who's the economic buyer? Who's your champion? And how do you get them? So you got to navigate the government people very well. And that's probably our next call. If you want to do another one someday, it's about, that's what I call the customer engagement. So we just talked about how do you build that foundation for the pipeline and where to go. Now it's like, who do you talk to, when and why? That's probably the next one. I call that the customer engagement. And that takes a little more experience too, as you're going through some of these conversations of how do you position it so that you get committed work share versus just signing the agreement like the Kramer, I'll take it. Or take all the free coffee in the world. I'll take it. If I got the 50 grand, I'll leave it on the table. So we want to, and that's the goal, is to help companies first, don't invest too much too fast. Do you really want to go down this path? And if you do, this is what it's going to take, and invest in some tools and some people. And if you are going to that next level, we can train them up. But most importantly, once your team gets going, I think the real value I help with the companies I do now is that execution phase. So now that they're starting to go through this, it's like I was like the closer for them. Remember, the price of entry is fill out that qual sheet. We didn't talk about a qual sheet, John, but once they get the qual sheet, I'm like, okay, they're telling me the contract vehicle, what's the scope and how we align. So now I know we're relevant. So when I used to do from our old companies, like you get me there, price of mission, and you're in the batting cages 24 hours, I'm with you. You don't fill out that qual sheet, you ain't getting to the plate, right? So that's what I'm helping the companies. And the more successful ones are success and quid pro quo here is that the ones that are following this, but they also need coaching on like, okay, how do I have this conversation? So I by the way, everything I'm talking about, we have I have templates for everything, John. So you have a qual sheet template, you have language template, who to call, there's a cheat, it's all like cheat sheets. And it gets to the point where now we got a pursuit plan with actions and expected outcomes. So we're going to call Raytheon, or we're going to call these builders, who we're going to call, what vehicles they have. And the final part, which we can talk about next time, is now customer engagement. Yeah. How do I take that, get to the table, and what's my goal? Walk away with a teaming agreement with committed work share. I'm getting everything and I do well. If I help, they're gonna give me when the task orders come through, So that's what I'm helping companies on their journey.
You're the man. You're the man. So we'll put that information into the show notes on how to get a hold of you. We're going to dissect this then producers are going to help us dissect this and really kind of figure out. I think you're right on the customer engagement. Now that I have all this information, I have my value proposition. How do I go execute and win a deal? You talked about how to prepare to get a deal. Now we go talk about how winning a deal, and I'm looking forward to that. But I thank you so much for sharing your information, Bud, and your knowledge. I've enjoyed the relationship and your friendship, and none the least the amount of information that you've shared with me over the years to help educate me on a very fruitful pot of money that once you learn how to go get it, you can get it.
Yeah, John, thank you. The pleasure is all mine. And, I have a little bit of passion here. I get a little tone, and hopefully you don't have to edit out too much. I thought I did okay there. In the past, it might have been a little challenge, but I was paying attention.
You did well.
But I appreciate it, everybody. Mac, you too as well. Great questions. And hopefully people that are listening, it at least spurred something to things that they should be aware of or want to do a little homework on. But they can always reach out, right, John?
You got it.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom.
Awesome. Thank you,
Cap. Thanks to everyone for listening to another episode of the Revenue Builders Podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to check us out at forcemanagement.com.